The laughter wasn't just loud, it was cruel, ricocheting off the mahogany walls of the law firm like gunfire. My father leaned back, his eyes dancing with malicious delight, while my brother wiped a tear of mirth from his cheek. They had just inherited an empire. I held a handful of crumpled bills and a legacy of humiliation. Or so they thought. I was sitting at a desk at Sterling and Associates in downtown Manhattan, with dark wood paneling covering the walls. My hands were clasped tightly in my lap, while the leather chair squeaked beneath my weight. The air conditioning hummed softly, but nothing could cool the tension radiating from my family members scattered around the conference table. The reading of my millionaire grandfather Arthur's will had just concluded, and the silence that followed felt deafening. The lawyer, Mr. Sterling, adjusted his thin-rimmed glasses, clearing his throat as he announced the final distribution. My father, Marcus, had received $12 million. My brother Tyler got $8 million, and various cousins received between $2 to $5 million each. When Mr. Sterling finally turned to me, his voice seemed to echo from somewhere very distant. My inheritance was just $1,000 in cash. The room exploded in cruel and bitter laughter. Marcus leaned back in his chair, a satisfied smirk spreading across his weather-beaten face as he watched me process the humiliation. His graying beard couldn't hide the cruel satisfaction dancing in his dark eyes. Tyler threw his head back, letting out a harsh cackle that bounced off the polished walls of the office. At 28, my brother always had our father's talent for making others feel small, and today was no exception. "Well, well," Marcus drawled, his voice dripping with fake sympathy. "It seems Grandpa finally showed everyone what he really thought of our little schoolteacher." He emphasized the word schoolteacher, as if it were something toxic he'd found on the sole of his shoe. Tyler wiped tears of laughter from his eyes and said, "Maybe I could frame those $1,000, sis. Hang them right next to my diploma from that state school." His expensive suit and tough talk couldn't hide the malice that always lived in his heart. My cousin Jessica, a woman in her early 30s with perfectly blown-out black hair and a designer dress that probably cost more than my monthly salary, giggled while covering her mouth with a manicured hand. "Oh my God. I feel so sorry for you, Sarah. I mean, what are you going to do with that? Throw a party for a month?" Brian, Jessica's younger brother, shook his head in feigned disappointment. His voice carried the same condescending tone I remembered from family gatherings in childhood. "Grandpa always said actions have consequences. I guess choosing to live like a poor fool finally caught up with you." I remained silent, studying the crisp bills in my hands. Something seemed different about them, unusual, in a way I couldn't identify immediately. I wondered if they realized that silence isn't always weakness. Sometimes it's just the calm before the storm. While my relatives continued their celebration and mockery, I turned each bill over carefully. The serial numbers looked normal at first glance, but as I examined them closer under the fluorescent office lighting, I noticed something extraordinary. My grandfather, Arthur, had written numbers and lowercase letters on the borders of each bill, so small and precise they were almost invisible unless you knew where to look. The marks seemed to have been made with an extremely fine-point pen, the kind Arthur used for his meticulous business notes. My pulse quickened as I traced the barely visible characters with my fingertip. Tyler noticed my intense focus on the money and burst into laughter again. "Look at her! She's counting it like there might be more money hidden somewhere." "Accept it, Sarah. You got exactly what you deserved. Nothing." Marcus stood up, adjusting his tie with an air of superiority. "I always told Arthur you lacked the killer instinct necessary for true success. You chose to waste your life teaching spoiled brats instead of entering the family business. That's what happens when you turn your back on opportunity." Jessica grabbed her purse, a leather creation that probably cost more than I earned in 3 months, and said they should celebrate the night, have dinner at that new steakhouse on the Upper East Side. On her, obviously. She looked at me with fake pity and said, "Sorry, Sarah, but I don't think they accept subway tokens as payment." As my family made plans for their expensive celebration, I continued studying the mysterious marks. The more I examined them, the more convinced I became that they formed some kind of code. Arthur had been a brilliant businessman, someone who never did anything without a purpose. These weren't random scratches or accidental marks. Brian was already on the phone, probably calling his financial advisor, saying he was thinking about that yacht they looked at last summer. With $5 million, he could finally make an offer. Tyler grabbed his own cell phone, scrolling through luxury car sites, saying he had been eyeing a Lamborghini for months, and it was finally time to close the deal. The lawyer, Mr. Sterling, began gathering his papers with practical efficiency. His expression remained professionally neutral, but I caught him looking at me with what might have been sympathy, or perhaps curiosity. While my family continued preparing and planning, I carefully folded the bills and put them in my purse. The marks were starting to make sense now. I could see what appeared to be coordinates, and below them, words so small they were barely legible. First National Bank, Box 847. I trust what others cannot see. My heart hammered against my ribs when the meaning became clear. Arthur hadn't just left me money. He had left me a message. A secret that none of these cruel and greedy people around me imagined existed. I stood up silently, smoothing down my simple black dress. As Marcus, Tyler, Jessica, and Brian continued making their grand plans and laughing cruelly, I walked toward the door. None of them bothered to say goodbye or even acknowledge my departure. They were too busy dividing their new wealth and planning how to spend it. But when I reached the door, Tyler's voice cut through the air one last time. "Hey, Sarah, don't forget to send us a thank you card when you buy yourself a breakfast with that fortune." Their laughter followed me down the hallway, but for the first time since I entered that office, I felt something other than humiliation burning in my chest. I felt hope. The morning sun cast long shadows on the sidewalk as I walked toward First National Bank, clutching my purse against my body. I had barely slept, spending the night deciphering Arthur's enigmatic message and trying to understand what he could have hidden for me to find. The bank's imposing glass facade reflected my nervous expression as I approached the entrance. Inside, the marble floor echoed the soft conversations of morning clients. I approached the service counter, where a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and graying brown hair looked up from her computer screen. "Good morning, I'm Mrs. Higgins. How can I help you today?" Her voice carried the warm professionalism of someone who spent years helping people navigate their financial needs. My voice trembled slightly when I spoke. "I need to access safe deposit box number 847. My grandfather died recently, and I believe he left something for me there." "Mrs." Higgins' fingers moved across the computer with efficiency. "Let me check our records. May I see your ID and the authorization documentation?" I handed over my driver's license and explained the unusual circumstances. "I don't have the traditional paperwork, but I have this." I carefully pulled the marked bills from my purse, showing her Arthur's tiny notations. Mrs. Higgins studied the money with attention, her eyebrows raising in surprise. "These marks are quite unusual. Let me call our manager, Mr. Davidson. He'll know how to handle this situation." Within minutes, a tall man in his 50s appeared beside Mrs. Higgins' desk. Mr. Davidson had silver hair and piercing blue eyes that seemed to take everything in at once. He wore a perfectly pressed navy blue suit that conveyed authority and experience. "Ms. Bennett, I'm David Davidson, the bank manager. Mrs. Higgins mentioned you are asking about box 847. May I see those bills?" I handed over the money with trembling fingers. The moment Mr. Davidson's eyes focused on Arthur's marks, his face underwent a dramatic transformation. The color drained from his cheeks, and his professional composure cracked for an instant. "Please, follow me to my office immediately," he whispered with urgency, looking around the busy lobby as if worried someone might be watching us. Mr. Davidson's office was a sanctuary of polished wood and leather, with family photos and banking awards decorating the walls. He closed the door carefully and activated a small device on his desk that I presumed was some kind of privacy scrambler. "Ms. Bennett, your grandfather and I have been planning this moment for years. Arthur knew that one day someone would come here with these exact bills marked with his distinct handwriting. He was waiting for someone worthy of deciphering his message. My mouth went dry. What do you mean by worthy, mister? Davidson sat heavily in his chair, suddenly looking much older than his age. Arthur spent the last decade of his life observing his family very carefully. He documented everything, Ms. Bennett. Every conversation, every business transaction, every moral compromise. He discovered things about your father and brother that are going to shock you. What kind of things? I asked, although part of me already suspected the answer would be devastating. Mr. Davidson opened a security file and pulled out a thick brown folder. Your father, Marcus, has been embezzling money from Arthur's companies for 15 years. These aren't small amounts. We are talking about nearly $30 million stolen through shell companies and fraudulent contracts. I felt the room spin around me. 30 million? That is just Marcus. Your brother, Tyler, has been selling privileged information to Arthur's competitors for the last 8 years. Every big deal, every strategic plan, every proprietary development, Tyler has handed everything over to rival firms for substantial payments. The damage he caused to the family business is incalculable. We estimate Arthur's companies lost hundreds of millions in potential revenue because of Tyler's betrayal. The weight of this revelation hit me like a physical force. It felt like the floor had turned to quicksand, and my entire family history was a lie written in red ink. But why didn't Grandpa expose them? Why didn't he stop them? Mr. Davidson's expression became even more serious. Because Arthur was a strategist, not someone who reacted on impulse. He knew an immediate confrontation would only make them hide better. Instead, he chose patience. He gathered proof, methodically building an unshakable case while pretending to remain oblivious to their crimes. Recordings, financial documents, photographs, testimonies, everything necessary to ensure justice was served properly and completely. Arthur spent his final years not just as a grandfather, but as an investigator, building the most comprehensive corporate fraud case I have ever witnessed. I struggled to process this information. The family I thought I knew was nothing more than an elaborate facade hiding years of systematic theft and betrayal. Mr. Davidson continued, his voice getting softer, but the most painful discovery was yet to come. Arthur found out about your cousin's involvement, just 6 months before his death. Jessica and Brian were not innocent bystanders. They were active participants in the conspiracy. Jessica and Brian. My voice came out as just a whisper. They created fake charity organizations, shell NGOs, to launder the stolen money. Your cousins have been helping your father and brother clean their illegal gains through fraudulent donations and manipulated tax deductions. The NGOs only exist on paper, Ms. Bennett. Every dollar donated was immediately funneled back to offshore accounts controlled by your relatives. The room seemed to be closing in around me. How long has this been going on? Based on Arthur's investigation, the conspiracy started small, about 15 years ago, with Marcus diverting modest amounts, but it grew and became more sophisticated over time as Tyler and, eventually, your cousins joined the operation. When Arthur discovered the full extent, they were stealing millions annually and had become incredibly careless because they believed their own family would never suspect them. I thought about the reading of the will, the cruel laughter, and their sense of entitlement. They have no idea you know all this. Absolutely no idea. Arthur was a master at maintaining his facade of ignorance while secretly documenting every crime they committed. They genuinely believe they outsmarted him, and that the inheritance represents the reward for years of successful fraud. Mr. Davidson stood up and walked to the window, looking down at the busy street below. Arthur made me promise to wait for the right person to decipher his message. He knew that whoever cared enough to examine those bills carefully would be someone with the integrity to handle what they discovered responsibly. But why me? I asked. Why not the authorities? Why not handle this through the proper legal channels? Immediately, Mr. Davidson turned to face me, and for the first time since I entered his office, he smiled. "Because Arthur had a final plan, Miss Bennet, and you are the only person he trusted to execute it correctly." Mr. Davidson led me down a narrow corridor I hadn't noticed during my first visit to his office, passing through several security doors that required his access card and biometric reading. The basement of the First National Bank seemed like an entirely different world, designed for absolute privacy and security. "Arthur rented our largest safe deposit box 5 years ago," Mr. Davidson explained as we walked. "But what he kept there goes far beyond typical valuables or important documents." We stopped in front of box 847, which was significantly larger than the standard boxes I had seen in movies. Mr. Davidson inserted 2 keys simultaneously, while I offered my identification one last time. The metal box slid open to reveal thick folders, recording devices, and photographs organized with military precision. "Arthur was methodical about everything," David said, while I looked at the contents. "Every document is dated, every recording transcribed, every photograph cataloged. He approached this investigation like he approached business, with absolute meticulousness and attention to detail." I picked up the first folder, labeled simply "Financial Crimes of Marcus." Inside were bank statements, transfer records, and corporate documents that painted a devastating picture of systematic theft. Page after page detailed how my father had created fictitious consulting firms, approved fraudulent invoices, and redirected company funds to personal accounts. "Read this," I whispered, grabbing a bank statement. "He transferred $2,300,000 in a single month. How did no one notice?" "Arthur noticed," Mr. Davidson replied grimly. "But Marcus was careful to skim funds from different subsidiaries, keeping each theft below the threshold that would trigger automatic audits. He understood the system well enough to exploit its weaknesses." The next page contained evidence of Tyler's espionage activities. Printed emails showed him communicating with competitors, selling confidential information about future mergers, new product developments, and strategic partnerships. Some messages included actual photographs of internal documents taken with Tyler's cell phone. "Your brother was remarkably brazen," Mr. Davidson observed as I flipped through the communications. "He didn't even bother using code words or anonymous accounts. He conducted these transactions using his personal email and phone number." A chain of emails caught my attention particularly. Tyler had sold advance notice of Arthur's planned acquisition of a competitor, allowing rivals to make a counteroffer that ended up costing Arthur's business $47 million in lost opportunities. "That is treason against his own family," I said, my voice heavy with anger. "It gets worse," warned Mr. Davidson, handing me a folder marked Extended Family Network. Inside were surveillance photographs showing Jessica and Brian meeting with financial consultants, lawyers, and what looked like money laundering specialists. Arthur somehow managed to document their entire operation, from the initial establishment of the shell NGOs to the complex chain of transactions used to clean the stolen funds. The photographs came accompanied by detailed financial records showing how the fake charities operated. Donations would be made using stolen money. Tax deductions would be claimed on the charitable contributions, and then the funds would be immediately withdrawn and transferred to offshore accounts. The charities never performed any real charitable work or helped genuine causes. They claimed to be feeding homeless families and funding educational programs, I read in a document, but every penny went straight to their personal accounts. Mr. Davidson nodded solemnly. "Your cousins were particularly creative with their schemes. They established multiple charities with names similar to legitimate organizations, confusing donors and regulators while maximizing their capacity to move illegal funds without detection." As I kept reading, I discovered that Arthur had been tracking the conspiracy for much longer than Mr. Davidson had initially indicated. Some of the earliest documents dated back 17 years, suggesting Arthur suspected trouble almost from the start, but chose to investigate quietly instead of confronting the situation immediately. He was building a legal case. I realized all this evidence would be admissible in court. Absolutely. Arthur worked with former FBI investigators to ensure every piece of evidence was collected legally and documented properly. He wanted to guarantee that when justice finally arrived, it would be swift and complete. I picked up a small recording device and looked questioningly at Mr. Davidson. What is in these conversations? Arthur started using recording equipment during family gatherings, business meetings, and private discussions. He has your father and brother confessing their crimes, planning future thefts, and laughing about how easy it was to fool him. The betrayal cut deeper than I imagined possible. They thought he was senile and trusting. They had no idea he was documenting everything they said and did. Arthur was many things, but senile was never one of them. His mind remained sharp until the end. He simply allowed his family to believe what they wanted to believe because it served his investigation. At the bottom of the box, I found a sealed envelope marked, "Only for Sarah. Final instructions." My hands trembled as I opened it, recognizing Arthur's distinct handwriting covering several pages. "My dearest Sarah," the letter began. "If you are reading this, it means you were the only one who cared enough to decipher my message and discover the truth about our family. I pray you are strong enough to handle what you've learned, and wise enough to use that knowledge responsibly." The letter continued for several pages, detailing Arthur's growing suspicions, his decision to investigate privately, and his heartbreak at discovering the extent of his family's betrayal. But the final paragraphs contained information that made everything else seem insignificant in comparison. "I have terminal cancer, Sarah. I have maybe 6 months to live, but I haven't told anyone. I am using these final months not to seek treatment that would only delay the inevitable, but to conclude my investigation and ensure justice is eventually done. Most importantly, I am using this time to ensure the family's legitimate wealth ends up in the hands of someone who will use it honorably." I looked at Mr. Davidson with tears in my eyes. He knew he was dying. Arthur was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer 2 years ago. He refused treatment that could have extended his life by a few months because he said he had more important work to finish. He spent these final years not only gathering evidence against the conspirators, but also taking measures to protect legitimate assets from being stolen or destroyed. The letter's final revelation was the most shocking of all. I discovered that Marcus, Tyler, Jessica, and Brian are planning to steal even more money immediately after my death. They believe they will inherit my wealth legitimately, but then they intend to loot whatever remains of the company assets and disappear before anyone notices. They have already made arrangements with banks in tax havens and bought properties in countries without extradition treaties. They aren't just thieves, Sarah. They are potential fugitives, planning to abandon everything and everyone as soon as they've grabbed what they want. I placed the letter on the table with shaking hands. They are planning to vanish. Arthur suspected that, and that was why he accelerated his investigation and made arrangements for everything you are discovering today. He knew traditional inheritance processes would give them time to steal more money and flee the country. He needed a way to expose them quickly while protecting the legitimate assets and guaranteeing they faced justice for their crimes. Looking at the overwhelming evidence spread before me, I finally understood the magnitude of Arthur's final plan. This wasn't just about revealing some financial irregularities or family squabbles. It was about stopping a coordinated criminal conspiracy that threatened to destroy everything Arthur had built, while ensuring the guilty parties faced appropriate consequences for their actions. "What should I do with all this?" I asked, feeling completely overwhelmed. Mr. Davidson smiled for the second time since I met him. "That depends on how much you trust your grandfather's judgment, Mrs. Bennet, because this is just the beginning of what he prepared for you." Mr. Davidson reached into the back of the safe and pulled out a second sealed envelope, this one marked with today's date and my full name written in Arthur's careful calligraphy. "Arthur instructed me to give this to you only after you had reviewed all the evidence and understood the full scope of your family's crimes." I opened the envelope with hands that had stopped shaking. Inside was another long letter, but this one was different. Where the previous letter was full of disappointment and sorrow, this one radiated controlled rage and strategic thinking. My dearest Sarah, read aloud. By now you understand our family isn't what we pretended to be. Marcus, Tyler, Jessica, and Brian robbed me for years. While they believed I was old and too trusting to notice the betrayal, I have a final surprise for them, and I need your help to execute it correctly. Mr. Davidson gestured for me to continue reading. The next paragraphs detailed Arthur's master plan with the precision of a military operation. The $12 million I left for Marcus and the $8 million I left for Tyler represent carefully calculated amounts. These numbers weren't arbitrary, Sarah. They correspond exactly to the amount of money I can prove they stole from me over the years. By accepting the inheritance, they are essentially confessing to the crimes, while simultaneously incriminating themselves by spending money they obtained illegally. I looked at Mr. Davidson in astonishment. He gave them back their own stolen money. It's better than that, said Mr. Davidson with a grim smile. Keep reading. Arthur's letter continued. The $5 million I left for Jessica and the $2 million I left for Brian similarly correspond to the amounts they laundered through their fake charities. Every dollar they received in my will can be traced back to the money they stole from me through their fraudulent schemes. When they spend this inheritance, they will be spending the proceeds of their own crimes. But how does that help expose them? I asked. Read the next page, suggested Mr. Davidson. I spent the last 18 months working with federal investigators to document every aspect of their conspiracy. FBI agent Miller from the Financial Crimes Division is coordinating with me to build cases against all 4 conspirators. However, we needed them to incriminate themselves even further by spending the stolen money in ways that prove their guilt beyond any reasonable doubt. My pulse raced as I read Arthur's detailed explanation. He had deliberately given large inheritances to his family, knowing they would immediately begin spending lavishly, creating a clear trail of evidence that would demonstrate their pattern of criminal behavior over the long term. The inheritance money is marked, Sarah, not visibly like the bills I left for you, but electronically. Every dollar they received can be tracked through the banking system. When Marcus buys his yacht and Tyler buys his sports cars, they will be generating proof of money laundering and criminal conspiracy. Their spending will prove they knew the money was stolen, because no innocent person spends unexpected inheritance money in the specific patterns that correspond to criminal behavior. I placed the letter on the table for a moment, trying to process the sophistication of Arthur's trap. It was a game of chess, where the pawns didn't even know they were on the board. He used their greed against them. Arthur understood psychology as well as he understood business, explained Mr. Davidson. He knew Marcus and Tyler would immediately start spending their inheritance on luxury items because they were always impatient and materialistic. He also knew Jessica and Brian would use their inheritance to expand their money laundering operations because they had become addicted to the profits of their illegal activities. I continued reading, but the most important element of my plan concerns the legitimate wealth I accumulated through legal business activities over the last 50 years. That money, approximately $400 million, was carefully removed from all accounts your relatives knew about and transferred to undetectable trust funds that can only be accessed using the codes I marked on your inheritance of $1,000. My breath stopped completely. $400 million! Mr. Davidson nodded solemnly. Arthur spent 2 years secretly liquidating assets, selling properties, and transferring funds without anyone in his family noticing. Every dollar of legitimate wealth was placed out of their reach and preserved for you to inherit. But why me? I whispered. Why not just donate to charity or give to other family members? Arthur's letter anticipated my question. Why are you the only person in our family who chose integrity over wealth? Sarah, you rejected my offers to pay for an expensive education. You rejected my suggestions to enter the family business, and you rejected every attempt I made to give money or gifts. You chose to live modestly as a teacher because you wanted to earn your way through life honestly. Tears began to stream down my face as I read Arthur's explanation of how he had watched me struggle financially while maintaining my principles. Never asking for help, even when I desperately needed it. Never compromising my values, even when doing so would have made my life much easier. I tested everyone in our family over the years, Sarah. I offered every opportunity to prove their character, demonstrate integrity, show they valued family relationships more than money. Marcus, Tyler, Jessica, and Brian failed these tests repeatedly. They chose greed over loyalty, deception over honesty, and theft over earning their own success. Even when choosing integrity made your life harder. I wiped my eyes and continued reading. Arthur's plan had a final element that took my breath away. I also planted false evidence suggesting even larger hidden assets exist. Sarah, documents that Marcus and Tyler will find when they investigate my office after the funeral. Papers suggesting I have hundreds of millions more hidden in secret accounts. This false evidence will drive them to be even more reckless and desperate in their pursuit of money that doesn't exist. Mr. Davidson handed me a tissue and watched as I absorbed the full scope of Arthur's psychological manipulation. Your grandfather foresaw that Marcus and Tyler would be obsessed with finding these non-existent hidden assets. He knew their greed would outweigh their caution, causing them to take increasingly desperate and illegal actions that would give federal investigators even more evidence of their criminal intent. The final paragraphs of Arthur's letter outlined the endgame. When the FBI arrests them for their crimes, they will discover that the money they have been stealing and laundering for years was restored to its rightful place in the family wealth. The $400 million you are inheriting, Sarah, includes not only my legitimate earnings, but also every dollar they stole from me, recovered through careful legal action and returned to where it belongs. I looked at Mr. Davidson with a mixture of admiration and disbelief. He recovered everything. Every penny, plus interest and damages. Arthur's investigation was so thorough and his evidence so overwhelming that recovering the stolen funds was relatively simple once the authorities got involved. Your relatives have been spending stolen money for years, but that money never really vanished. It was just temporarily in the wrong place. Arthur's letter concluded with instructions for me to meet FBI Agent Miller, who would coordinate the final stages of the investigation and help me understand my role in bringing justice to our family. He also provided detailed information about the legitimate commercial funds I would inherit, and his hopes for how I might use that wealth to help others. "Is there anything else?" Mr. Davidson asked calmly. Arthur left specific instructions about timing. Agent Miller is waiting for my call. The moment I contact her, federal operations will begin at your relatives' homes and offices. Are you ready for that to happen? I thought about their cruel laughter at the reading of the will, about the years stealing from Arthur while pretending to love him, about their plans to disappear after stealing whatever remained of his life's work. I thought about all the students I could help with Arthur's legitimate wealth, all the good I could do with the money that had been earned honestly and preserved through his sacrifice. "Make the call," I said it firmly. Mr. Davidson picked up his secure line, fingers moving with practiced precision as he dialed a number he clearly had memorized. "Agent Miller, this is David Davidson from First National. Was the package delivered?" "Yes, she is here with me now. We are ready to proceed." He hung up and turned to me with an expression that mixed excitement with somber determination. "FBI Agent Miller will be here in 20 minutes. In exactly 1 hour, coordinated raids will begin at 4 locations simultaneously. Your relatives have no idea what is about to happen." I felt a strange combination of anticipation and fear. How long has the FBI been involved? Arthur contacted them 14 months ago with preliminary evidence. Agent Miller has been building federal cases against your family members since then, using Arthur's investigation as a foundation for much larger criminal charges. Money laundering, tax evasion, wire fraud, conspiracy, and RICO violations. The sentences they face could reach 20 or 30 years each. While we waited for Agent Miller, Mr. Davidson showed me additional documents Arthur had prepared. Financial projections showing the true value of the family business empire once the stolen funds were recovered and returned. Deeds to real estate properties I had no idea existed. Investment portfolios that had been carefully managed and expanded over decades. Arthur was worth much more than $400 million. Mr. Davidson explained. These are just the liquid assets he transferred to his trusts. When you include business holdings, real estate investments, and recovered stolen funds, you are looking at an inheritance worth nearly $600 million. The number was so large, I couldn't really comprehend it. What should I do with this kind of money? Whatever you believe Arthur believed you would do, use it wisely. Help others, and never let this corrupt your character the way it corrupted theirs. Agent Miller arrived precisely on schedule. A woman in her early 40s with short dark hair and the kind of confident posture that spoke of years dealing with complex financial crimes. She wore a simple suit and carried a briefcase that looked like it had seen considerable use. Ms. Bennett, I'm Agent Miller. Your grandfather was an extraordinary man who provided my team with the most comprehensive evidence package we have ever received for a case of this magnitude. Thanks to his investigation, we have sufficient evidence to secure convictions against all 4 suspects. She opened her briefcase and pulled out several thick folders. Arthur's cooperation allowed us to obtain additional evidence through legal surveillance methods. We have monitored your relatives' communications, financial transactions, and business activities for the last 8 months. What kind of evidence? I asked. Phone conversations where Marcus discusses plans to steal additional assets after Arthur's death. Emails where Tyler arranges to sell more proprietary information to competitors. Bank records showing Jessica and Brian establishing new fraudulent charities last month. They never stopped their criminal activities, Ms. Bennett. If anything, they intensified their illegal behavior because they believed Arthur's death would eliminate any chance of being discovered. Agent Miller showed me surveillance photographs taken outside Marcus's mansion in the Hamptons, from Tyler's office near Wall Street, and from the building where Jessica and Brian operated their fake charity network. We have been watching them for months, documenting their continued criminal activities and waiting for the right moment to move forward with arrests. Why wait until now? I asked. Because Arthur insisted you should have the opportunity to understand the full scope of their betrayal before we proceeded. He wanted you to see the evidence firsthand and make an informed decision about proceeding with criminal charges. By law, you are considered the primary victim of their conspiracy, since you are Arthur's legitimate heir. The weight of this responsibility seemed enormous. What happens if I decide not to press charges? The federal crimes they committed do not depend on your cooperation. Agent Miller explained that we have enough evidence to prosecute them regardless of your wishes, but Arthur wanted you to understand that you have significant influence over how aggressively we seek maximum penalties versus accepting plea deals. Mr. Davidson checked his watch. The raids begin in 35 minutes. Mrs. Bennett, Agent Miller needs to know if you want to observe the arrests or prefer to remain here while operations proceed. I thought about Arthur's letter, about his disappointment upon discovering his family's true nature, about his careful planning to ensure justice was served. I want to see what happens. Agent Miller nodded in approval. We are going to monitor the raids from a mobile command unit. You will be able to watch everything without being directly involved in the arrests. As we prepared to leave the bank, Agent Miller gave me a final briefing on what to expect. Based on our surveillance, Marcus is currently at his estate meeting with financial consultants about offshore investments. Tyler is at his office preparing to leave the city for what he thinks is a business trip, but which we believe to be, in reality, an attempt to establish residence in a country without an extradition treaty. Jessica and Brian are at the charity offices, probably destroying evidence and preparing to transfer more stolen funds. Are they all planning to escape? I asked. Arthur foresaw they would try to escape as soon as they had secured the maximum amount of stolen money possible. That is why timing was so critical. We needed to act before they could disappear with additional funds or establish themselves beyond the reach of U.S. law. Mr. Davidson closed the safe and returned Arthur's evidence to its secure place. This material will remain here until needed for the trials. Your grandfather chose our bank specifically for our security protocols and our experience in handling sensitive legal documents. As we walked toward the garage, Agent Miller received a radio communication from her team leaders. All units are in position. The subjects appear to be following their normal routines, with no indication they suspect law enforcement attention. We are authorized to proceed according to schedule. I got into the back of Agent Miller's unmarked vehicle, my mind racing with thoughts about what the next few hours would bring. Arthur had spent the last years of his life building this moment, sacrificing his relationships with his family to gather the evidence necessary to bring them to justice. "Agent Miller," I said as we drove through downtown traffic, "what made my grandfather first suspect his family was stealing from him?" "A discrepancy in quarterly financial reports about 3 years ago. Arthur noticed that certain subsidiary companies were showing unusual expense patterns that didn't correspond to their operational activities. When he investigated personally, instead of delegating to Marcus or Tyler, he discovered the first evidence of fraudulent invoicing and ghost employees. And that led to all the rest. Arthur realized that if Marcus was willing to steal relatively small amounts through fake invoices, there were likely bigger crimes being committed. He decided to investigate comprehensively instead of confronting the immediate problems, which led to the discovery of the full scope of the conspiracy. When we approached the mobile command unit, I could see several police vehicles positioned strategically around the city, all waiting for the coordinated signal to act simultaneously against targets who had no idea their years of crime were about to catch up with them. "Miss Bennett," said Agent Miller as we parked, "are you sure you are ready for this? Watching your relatives get arrested will be emotionally difficult, even knowing what they did." I thought about Arthur's sacrifice, about the students I could help with his legitimate inheritance, about the importance of ensuring justice was finally served after years of betrayal and theft. "I am ready," I said firmly. "Let's finish what my grandfather started." The Mobile Command Unit was a sophisticated operations center, filled with monitors, communication equipment, and federal agents coordinating the simultaneous raids. Agent Miller positioned me where I could observe everything, remaining safe, far from the actual arrests. "Team Alpha is approaching Marcus Bennett's residence," came the first radio report. On the main monitor, I watched unmarked vehicles surrounding my father's extensive estate in the exclusive Hamptons neighborhood. The mansion looked even more impressive in aerial surveillance footage than I remembered from family gatherings. "Team Beta is in position outside Tyler's commercial building," reported another voice. A second monitor showed federal agents preparing to enter the skyscraper in the financial district, where my brother conducted his supposedly legitimate consulting business. "Teams Gamma and Delta are ready at the charity office locations," arrived the final confirmation. 2 additional monitors displayed the modest office buildings where Jessica and Brian operated their fraudulent organizations, buildings that looked entirely innocent from the outside. Agent Miller spoke into her radio with calm authority. "All teams, you are authorized to execute Operation Family Tree. It is active now." I watched fascinated as the raids began simultaneously across the city. At Marcus's estate, agents approached the front door while others moved to secure rear exits and garage areas. The door opened to reveal my father in his expensive golf outfit, his face transforming from mild curiosity to absolute shock when federal agents flashed their badges and arrest warrants. "Marcus Bennett, you are under arrest for money laundering, conspiracy, tax evasion, and embezzlement." I heard through the audio feed. Marcus's mouth opened and closed silently as agents read his rights and placed handcuffs on his wrists. On the second monitor, Tyler's arrest was equally dramatic. Federal agents entered his commercial building and cornered him in his private conference room, where he was meeting with what appeared to be offshore banking representatives. Tyler tried to run toward a back exit, but found agents already positioned to intercept him. "Tyler Bennett, you are under arrest for corporate espionage, conspiracy, wire fraud, and money laundering." My brother's expensive suit couldn't hide his panic as he realized his escape route, carefully planned, had been anticipated and blocked. The arrests of Jessica and Brian were happening simultaneously at their respective charity offices. Both were in the middle of shredding documents when federal agents arrived, providing additional evidence of consciousness of guilt and obstruction of justice. "This is incredible," I whispered, while watching my relatives being taken into custody. They really had no idea what they were walking into. Agent Miller nodded grimly. Arthur's investigation was so discreet, they never suspected the FBI was involved. They believed they had successfully fooled an old man, and that his death would close any possibility of discovery. Over the next hour, I watched as federal agents methodically searched every location, seizing computers, financial records, and physical evidence. The amount of material being collected was staggering, filling several vehicles at each site. Team Alpha secured approximately $200,000 in cash at Marcus Bennett's home office, came a report. The money was hidden in a wall safe, along with falsified business documents and what appear to be numbers for additional offshore accounts. Team Beta confiscated Tyler Bennett's computers and discovered evidence he planned to leave the country tonight, reported another agent. His desk contains airline tickets, foreign bank account information, and documents suggesting he intended to establish permanent residence abroad. The evidence of flight risk was particularly damning because it supported Arthur's prediction that the conspirators would try to escape as soon as they had maximized their theft from the estate. Agent Miller turned to me with a satisfied expression. The psychological profile your grandfather made of your relatives was remarkably accurate. Marcus and Tyler acted exactly as he predicted, offering us additional evidence of criminal intent and guilty conscience. What happens now? I asked. Bail hearings will be held tomorrow morning. Based on the evidence we collected and the flight risk factors, I expect bail to be denied for all 4 defendants. The federal prosecutors handling this case believe they can secure solid convictions. As the raids wound down, Agent Miller showed me preliminary reports from the searches. Marcus's house contained evidence of additional financial crimes that hadn't been discovered during Arthur's investigation. Tyler's office revealed plans for future espionage activities and communications with foreign competitors interested in buying more proprietary information. The scope of their criminal activity was even larger than Arthur imagined. Agent Miller explained your relatives planned to significantly expand their illegal operations, using the inheritance as seed capital for more sophisticated money laundering and espionage schemes. Jessica and Brian's charity offices yielded evidence of multiple new fraudulent organizations in development, suggesting they planned to use their inheritance to establish an even more extensive network of fake NGOs to launder stolen funds. If Arthur hadn't stopped them when he did, your relatives could have stolen hundreds of millions more over the next few years. Agent Miller observed as night fell over New York City. I found myself back at Mr. Davidson's office at First National Bank, reviewing the final documents Arthur had prepared for this moment. The family's legitimate wealth was now completely secure and under my control, while the stolen assets had been recovered and would be returned to their rightful place in Arthur's estate. There is one final element in Arthur's plan, said Mr. Davidson, removing a last sealed envelope from his personal safe. This should be opened only after the arrests have been successfully concluded. Inside was a brief letter and a set of keys. Arthur's final message was simple but profound. Sarah, by now you understand the true cost of greed and the value of integrity. The keys in this envelope open a building I bought 6 months before my death. The address is written below. I think you'll be interested. The address was in my school district, just 3 blocks from where I taught elementary students from low-income families in the Bronx. Mr. Davidson drove me there as the sun set over the city, and I stood in awe to discover that Arthur had secretly purchased the entire complex of buildings that housed our struggling public school. He bought the school? I asked incredulously. Not just the school, replied Mr. Davidson, handing me additional documents. Arthur bought the neighboring properties and established a $50 million educational foundation to support students from disadvantaged backgrounds. He intended for you to manage the foundation and use it to offer opportunities to children whose families couldn't afford a quality education. As I stood in front of the school, where I taught for 5 years, struggling with inadequate resources and overcrowded classrooms, I realized Arthur had been watching my work and planning this surprise for months before his death. He wanted to support what you were already doing, explained Mr. Davidson. Instead of trying to change your career or convince you to enter the family business, he decided to increase your capacity to help students, offering the necessary resources to make a real difference. Arthur's final letter concluded with words that brought tears to my eyes. You chose education over wealth, integrity over comfort, and service over selfishness. Now you have the resources to follow your calling without the financial restrictions that limited your impact. Use this inheritance wisely. Help as many children as possible. And never forget that true wealth comes from the positive difference you make in other people's lives. 6 months later, I stood in the renovated lobby of what was now officially known as the Arthur Bennett Educational Institute, watching students from all over the city arrive for their first day at a school that would change their lives forever. The transformation had been remarkable, not just in the physical building, but in the educational opportunities we could now offer. With Arthur's inheritance and the recovered stolen funds, we created something extraordinary. The Institute offered full scholarships for students from low-income families, offering not only excellent education, but also meals, transportation, technology, and college prep courses that most of these children could never imagine accessing. "Miss Sarah!" yelled 8-year-old Lily Sanchez, running in my direction with enthusiasm. "I can't believe we have our own computers now!" Her joy was contagious, and I couldn't help smiling as she showed me the new tablet each student received for their studies. The morning news was playing on the television in our main office, and I caught a glimpse of the final chapter of my family's legal saga. Marcus had been sentenced to 22 years in federal prison for money laundering, conspiracy, and tax evasion. Tyler received 20 years for corporate espionage and fraud. Jessica and Brian got 15 years each for their roles in the money laundering conspiracy. All their assets were seized and distributed according to federal restitution guidelines, with the majority returning to Arthur's legitimate estate. None of them would be eligible for parole for at least 12 years, and their criminal convictions guaranteed they could never work in financial services or corporate management again. "Finally, it's over," said Mr. Davidson, who had been not only a financial consultant, but a close friend throughout this process. He visited the Institute regularly to check our progress and helped manage the educational foundation Arthur had established. "It's not over," I replied, watching our students settle into their new classrooms. "It's just beginning." That is what Arthur really wanted. Not revenge against his family, but opportunity for the kids who needed someone to believe in them. Agent Miller had stopped by earlier that morning to deliver the final financial reports. The recovery operation had been completely successful, returning every stolen dollar to its proper place, while ensuring my relatives faced the appropriate consequences for their crimes. "Your grandfather would be proud," she said. "Not just because justice was done, but because of what you are doing with his legacy." I walked through the Institute's hallways, observing the classes that Arthur's generosity made possible. Advanced science labs, where students performed experiments with equipment most public schools couldn't afford. Art studios, full of materials that allowed creative expression to flourish. A library stocked with thousands of books, and reading specialists who worked individually with students. In our computer lab, I found 15-year-old James Wilson working on programming projects that could lead to technology scholarships at major universities. 6 months ago, James had never touched a computer because his family couldn't afford one. Now, he was learning coding languages that could change his entire future. Miss Sarah called our guidance counselor Mrs. Chen. "The admissions officers from Columbia and NYU are here for the college prep meeting. Thanks to Arthur's foundation, we were able to offer college counseling services that helped our high school students navigate admissions processes and student aid programs. Many of our seniors were already receiving acceptance letters from prestigious universities, with full scholarships made possible by the educational fund Arthur created." As I walked to the meeting, I passed the framed photograph hanging in our main hallway. Arthur Bennett, smiling next to a group of students he had secretly sponsored for years before his death. Few people knew about his charitable activities because he always preferred anonymous donations. The college counseling session was inspiring to watch. Students who grew up believing a university education was beyond their financial reach. Now they discuss their dreams of becoming doctors, engineers, teachers, and business leaders. Arthur's legacy wasn't just about the money he left. It was about the hope and opportunity he had provided to young people who needed someone to invest in their potential. During lunch, I sat in my office reviewing thank you letters from parents whose children now had educational opportunities they never imagined were possible. One mother wrote about her daughter's new confidence in math after receiving tutoring support through our program. Another father wrote how his son discovered a passion for creative writing in our enhanced English classes. The $1,000 in marked bills that started this whole journey were framed on my office wall. A constant reminder of how Arthur had tested my character while preparing to transform my life. The bills represented more than money. They symbolized the importance of paying attention to details others might ignore, and the value of maintaining integrity, even when there seemed to be no reward. My phone rang, and I answered to hear the voice of the Secretary of Education. Sarah, I wanted you to know that the Arthur Bennett Institute was selected as a model program for educational innovation. The Department of Education wants to study your approach for potential implementation in other cities. Arthur's influence was expanding beyond what even he could have imagined. Our success was inspiring similar programs across the country, creating opportunities for thousands of additional students who needed someone to believe in their potential. When the day ended and the students went home, I reflected on the lessons Arthur taught me through his final plan. True wealth wasn't measured in dollars or assets, but in the positive impact you could have on other people's lives. Integrity wasn't avoiding wrongdoing. It was about actively choosing to do good, even when no one was looking. Marcus, Tyler, Jessica, and Brian chose greed over family, deception over honesty, and theft over earning their own success. They traded temporary financial gains for decades in prison and the permanent loss of their freedom and reputation. But Arthur chose differently, and his choice created ripples that would continue for generations. Every student who received an education through his foundation would have opportunities to help others in turn. Every family whose financial struggles were eased through our support programs could invest more in their children's future. The greatest irony was that Arthur's legitimate wealth had grown substantially since his death. The business holdings Marcus and Tyler tried to steal were now thriving under honest management. The real estate investments they tried to liquidate were appreciating. The Foundation's endowment fund was generating returns that would fund educational programs indefinitely. As I locked up the institute and went home, to my own modest apartment, I smiled, thinking about how my life had changed while remaining fundamentally the same. I still taught students, still focused on education, still lived simply despite having access to enormous wealth. The difference was that now I had the resources to help the kids much more than before. Arthur was right about the power of patience and strategic thinking. Instead of confronting his family's betrayal immediately, he chose to gather evidence methodically while planning a response that would guarantee lasting justice and positive results. His approach was more effective than any immediate confrontation could have been. Before sleeping, I read one last thank you letter that had arrived that afternoon. It was from Lily Sanchez, the 8-year-old girl who was so excited about her new tablet that morning. "Dear Miss Sarah," she had written in her careful handwriting, "thank you for making our school so wonderful. My mom says rich people usually don't help kids like us, but you are different. I want to be a teacher like you when I grow up, so I can help other kids too. Thank you for showing us that someone believes we can do big things." That letter captured everything Arthur hoped to accomplish through his final plan. He hadn't just punished the wrong. He had created opportunities for good. He hadn't just recovered stolen money. He had invested in human potential. He hadn't just taught me about inheritance. He had shown the true meaning of legacy. This is a work of fiction, yet it mirrors the quiet battles fought every day behind closed doors. While the vaults and the millions may be invented, the lesson remains dangerously real. Integrity is a currency that never devalues. In a world obsessed with taking, the ultimate power move is giving back, proving that the richest legacy isn't what you leave in a bank, but what you leave in a heart.